Welcome, Pramit. Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation is going to be about the upcoming US presidential election and how, regardless of the result of the election, how do we see the India-US relationship doing?
So if I were to try to abstract the basis for the Indo-US relationship, and as you mentioned, going back to the Bush administration and arguably even to the latter part of the Clinton administration, there has been no really major rupture between the two. There was some doubts in the first Obama administration, perhaps, but otherwise there's been really no concerns, and the trajectory has been fairly clear. So if I were to summarize the core pillars of this, it would be China, technology, democracy, and climate. And China and technology in many ways are the heart of the relationship. These are the most strategically important. And those have remained completely consistent throughout this entire period. And neither Harris or Trump, in my view, have said anything that remotely undermines either of them. The China bit, as I've mentioned, that the Obama years, the first 14 months or so, there was a bit of a tremor. It was partly because Obama tried to launch the G2 policy, failed largely because China wasn't interested. I don't see that changing. If anything, now America has become even more concerned and wary of China. And there's a total convergence between the two countries on the belief that the rise of China, particularly China in its present, should we say, state of mind under Xi Jinping, constitutes a strategic and economic threat. And the fact that the Quad created by Bush, continued by Obama, massively expanded under Trump, and then upgraded to a summit by Biden, is in many ways a measure of how that strategic thinking has gone. I don't see any change on that. I definitely do not see either candidate showing any fallback on that area. Technology is a bit more complicated, but it fundamentally, and I think the Modi-Biden summit last year, the joint statement and fact sheet laid that out, that America sees the need to create or boost India's technological capacities to make India a technology partner as crucial to its own struggle to maintain preeminence both against China and just generally for its economy.
Outside of the convergences, where do they diverge? Let's look at a scenario in which Vice President Harris wins. Can India expect the Harris-Walz administration to just simply take the Biden-Harris administration's policies forward? Or do you think there will be some departures?
A good question. So I remember I mentioned there were two other areas where the relationship is built on, and climate and democracy. The democracy part is where we tend to have problems with the Democrats, who argue that you may be an electoral democracy, but in terms of civil rights, human rights, press freedom, and so on, they feel that India has slipped. And so both in the Obama years and in the Biden years, we have seen India getting lectured, if you wish. It does not affect the broader policy. America has not, at no point of this has America sat down and said, we will not give you this technology, or we will vote against you because of this. But we wish to remind you that we have concerns about this. That, I think, will continue under Harris. But Harris is much more of a member of the progressive Democratic wing, much more left-wing than in either Obama or Biden is. So I would expect that lecturing to continue, and we may get a bit more of that. But keep in mind, for Harris, India, in many ways, a lot of that has been toned down in India anyway, domestically. The Kashmir policy has the Kashmir the change of Article 370, the end of the special constitutional status in Kashmir has been successfully almost completed. Kashmiris have in effect legitimized it by contesting a local election in which 64% of the population voted, and there was almost no violence. And Pakistan, the country that has been cut out of this, has basically said almost nothing, and has seemed to concede that this is not something that they really have much say on anymore. So I don't see that being an issue anymore. That's just simply gone. And so there will be I don't expect any lecturing on that front. in many ways, Kashmir is now off the diplomatic after 50 or so plus years, or 70 years really. Kashmir is simply no longer a concern for the international community. And again, on the question of minority rights in India, that is now less of a political issue in India, in part because it's a coalition government. And the fact that Modi faced an election setback earlier this year has actually, you'll notice, resulted in everybody saying, oh, actually, maybe India is still a completely functional democracy in every way. So I will expect the lecturing to continue on specific issues, but I don't expect it to go any much. I think what we will, and I think we will see, at least for the first year with Harris, very strong continuity with Biden, for the simple reason that she was not expecting to be the presidential candidate. So she has not really built up the circle of foreign policy advisors and so on. There's something like 5,000 positions that a US president, when they are elected, can choose and nominate their own people. She has nowhere close to that number. So she will keep a lot of those people.
Let's take this forward. It seems that many in India believe the religious freedom, minority rights, human rights, interference in lectures is solely a democratic problem. Do we think the Republicans in power would also be prescriptive on these areas? Do we think they will just ignore this? How do we see that?
Generally, the Republicans have always taken a much more realpolitik purview in foreign policy. So for them, the question of the domestic value structure of another country is not that relevant in their view in foreign policy. It's about hardcore interests. It's about military, security, economics, trade, yes. But if you are not fulfill the liberal democratic norms of the United States, that's really up to you to decide. It helps. There is a core there's at least one group, the neoconservatives in particular, who in many ways continue to argue that the value structure is important. But their requirements are relatively minimal, i.e. that you should just be a basic democracy, and that India easily fulfills. Nobody really denies that.
So should President Trump return to the White House, he has claimed multiple times that he would enact a blanket tariff on imports from countries like India. So this would not just be limited to India. What is limited to India are his statements criticizing India's own import tariffs and market access.
So let's talk there. These are two different types of stories. One is a macroeconomic question, the one on the tariffs on China, because that is about how China responds and the secondary effects of effectively a trade war followed by what everybody believes would be a currency war. And the other is the question of that, what will he do to India specifically on tariffs? Now, you may remember in the first administration, he did impose tariffs on India. India retaliated. A couple of things that while Trump is obsessed with tariffs and he says he loves them, blah, blah, the fact is tariffs are not very effective as a trade weapon. We imposed tariffs on Washington apples in response to his imposing tariffs on Indian steel. The price of Washington apples in India did not go up. There was absolutely no difference whatsoever. There's a whole army of lawyers around the world who specialize in figuring how to get around tariffs. And they would basically like, okay, that's all right. India has an FTA with Thailand. Thailand, under that FTA, there's no tariff on apples. The apples have to sit in Thailand for 2 days and then they become Thai. And so these Washington apples will go to Thailand, sit in a port for a while, and then come back to India. I mean that I made that up, but that's the kind of thing trade lawyers specialize in. And so tariffs are actually not a very useful instrument to block trade. They can be used in if you wish, the higher value added the product is, the more likely you can cause some problems. But tariffs are all about signaling. Now, if you look at what Bob Lighthizer, who is suspected to be the Treasury Secretary or something similar in the Trump administration, and was U.S. Trade Representative in the first Trump administration, he also has complained bitterly about this, but in the first administration, he had basically said, treated the tariffs, and this I think is what Trump will do, is treated the tariffs as a negotiating posture to lead to something else. So what was that thing? And when he was USTR, he made that very clear in his meetings with Indian Commerce Ministry officials. I want a free trade agreement with India. I wanted under some kind of a trade. Doesn't have to call it an FTA. America, both India and America are allergic to the term, phrase FTA. We just call it something else. But what at the core of it was not apples and blueberries and dairy products. That's there. But it was really about digital technology, that he wanted an understanding on what he saw as the future of international trade, which is digital standards, privacy, e-commerce, things like that. I remember, and he laid that out. And in fact, India and America had scheduled a meeting to begin that, a digital dialogue, in April of the year he proposed it. COVID broke out in February, and so that never happened, and then Trump fell from office. My guess is that's going to be the same thing that's going to be repeated again.
There are reports, the Bloomberg report from last month being one example, that calculates that by 2028, with a blanket 10% tariff on Indian imports into the US, the Indian economy would shrink, the Indian GDP, sorry, would shrink by 0.1%. An extension of similar reports on such tariffs also says that if an additional tariff is levied just on Chinese products, there is a possibility that some amount of balance will be felt by the Indian economy, because globally people would be looking at alternatives to China. And India, despite tariffs, will still continue to have cheap labor. So the products coming from India would still be cheaper. Where do you stand on this? How do you see this playing out?
So it's a difficult call. So the issue would be for India, we don't export that many goods to the United States. That's one of the reasons that the first Trump administration tariffs didn't have much impact. Some steel and so on were affected. Today, we have an issue that we are a reasonably large electronics exporter. And for example, Apple exports roughly $10 billion worth of iPhones from India. About $2.5 to $3 billion of that goes to the United States. If Trump were bizarrely to impose a tariff on effectively an American product made in India by an American company, that would have some impact. But Apple has manufacturing facilities all across the world. So what often a very large company will do, will just switch them around. They'll say, okay, the iPhones leaving Vietnam will now go to the United States, or the factories in America will increase their production. The ones in Mexico will ship to the United States, and the ones in India will now ship to wherever these places used to ship, and now need iPhones from somewhere else. So you would see giant companies move their assembly lines and redirect their shipping. So the net impact isn't that great. Where India is a huge exporter to the United States is service exports. The Global Capability Centers being the latest story in that. If you look at India's exports, service exports as a percentage of global service exports, we've gone from about 2.5 to 6 in barely 7 or 8 years. Manufactured exports have been more or less the same. They've stayed at about 1.5% of global goods exports. So we're still, in my view, not big enough yet to be greatly impacted by this, but I don't know the basis of the Bloomberg calculations. But my sense is that we don't, for example, export automobiles, which is one of our biggest. We do export jewelry, but whether, yeah, and whether that, so it's, and pharmaceutical products, but that affects American prices. So a lot of times America then quietly exempts generic medicine or something like that, because they know that impacts their consumers. So we'll see how that works.
Speaking of things that were enacted in the Trump administration that continued on in the Biden administration, do we see India's benefits under the Generalized System of Preferences, which is the GSP, that were revoked in 2019 under Trump? They never were returned with Biden-Harris. Do we see that changing?
My understanding is the general system of preferences is now politically no longer viable in the United States. There is no real support for this idea. That was part of a larger American commitment to holding up the international free trading system, including supporting the World Trade Organization. We don't see any American interest in the WTO anymore. The WTO is a derelict, drifting ship. It's almost totally dysfunctional now. And if America imposes tariffs unilaterally across the world, and it has, and it's retained them and will continue to use them as weapons, and puts other restrictions on international trade, it's not really committed to, so it's clearly no longer sees itself as an upholder of the international trading system. If that's the case, and I think that the trend on that is pretty clear, the GSP doesn't really fit in anymore. So what I think we'll see, and here I'm not a great expert, but we'll see that what used to be part of the GSP will now become broken up into a series of regional understandings. So the AGOA agreements that America has with Africa and similar parts of the world would probably be part of that. So you would see a fracturing of the GSP system into a series of agreements that America would give to individual countries or regions such as that.
Fair enough. Let's move on to another element of the policies that seem to impact Indians very directly, which is immigration. President Trump, in the last year of his presidency, he suspended H-1B visa applications that he then claimed had gotten worse because of COVID. During his campaign this summer, he claimed he would automate green cards for international students graduating from US colleges. Something, if that were to come true, it would really benefit Indian students. Now, that's a statement that his campaign has retracted, to be fair. What do you think immigration policies will be like in a second Trump term? How do you think Indian students and Indian workers would be impacted?
I think the broad consensus now in the United States between even Trump and to some degree at least centrist Democrats is illegal migration is politically now unsaleable in the United States. And even Harris has had to slowly sort of, and when questioned on illegal migration, Harris gets really gets very fuzzy in her answers. She tends to be fuzzy anyway, but in illegal migration, she goes all over the place. It is simply not popular. There's widespread anger and irritation about the illegality more than the actual immigration. And that is largely coming out of Mexico and Central America. There's a small group of Indians who also come in that, but they're not very large. So there is the crux, I think, of the real problem. So Trump has really hit out very hard. If anything, that is his number one political campaign agenda is on the immigration, because he knows that that is simply very unpopular. And illegal migrants from Central America at the core. That is consistent. And we will see a huge continuing crackdown on illegal migration by the United States, definitely under Trump, and I think even a little bit under Harris. I mean, we recently had America send back a airplane load of illegal migrants from India. This is under the Biden administration. This is not this is not Trump. This is just policy that's now being adopted across the board. The second part is about legal migration. There, Trump, as you correctly pointed out, has gone back and forth. But the sense is that when he is talking on his own and when he's not campaigning, he says, I don't have a problem with legal migrants. And I think that's a personal view that he holds closely, that he doesn't see a problem with legal migration. And the joke is that, he has Elon Musk on one side and Melania Trump on the other, both of them a product of legal migration into the country. But for campaign purposes, that is still unpopular with the core of his party. So he tends to then go back and forth on that. But I think in policy terms, and as you mentioned, Trump put a block on all H-1Bs, but only in the last year of his administration when he was campaigning. My impression is that that's the policy that will largely continue, that he will say we'll allow legal migration. The third element is the question of high-skilled labor that in many ways now goes beyond H-1Bs. What's interesting there, because that is almost completely out of the political arena altogether and has moved almost into the national security arena. And under Biden, and I think it'll continue under Trump, the hunt for tech talent in America has completely opened its doors. There are H-1B visas for highly skilled, not like IT workers, but a whole series of critical technologies, which are outside of quota. i.e. they have an virtually unlimited number of visas will be issued if you are a specialist in high-end AI, LLMs, if you are a synthetic biologist of certain capacities and so on. And at a time when Chinese scientists and students are being slowly squeezed out of their migration story, partly because of China's own actions, that path is going to just keep growing. And my sense is that has now become a national security imperative. Nobody talks about it, but it's there in the policy. And I don't think Trump will touch it because nobody in the American electorate really sees this as an issue. They're too small in number. But the system is now just not talking about it. They're just issuing the visas when those people show up.
Got it. Let's move our lens back to foreign policy for a minute. President Trump has NATO allies worried with his repeated claims of getting them to pay their fair share in defense expenditure. How do you see the US support of Ukraine evolving in a Trump presidency? Will it, in his approach to Ukraine, do you think the pressure on India's relationship with Russia will ease?
So yes, I don't think anyway, there is not that much pressure anyway by the United States on us and Russia. It's been a very clear strategic call. I met people in the State Department soon after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and they were quite clear. They said, look, we get this, that if you were to sanction Russia and you were not to get spare parts for your military, your air force, your armor would degrade within 6 to 8 months. The only country that would benefit from this would be China. So we're not interested. That's a long-term game of shifting you away. That's happening anyway, if only because Russia can't make a lot of its weapons anymore. And if you just saw how Israel completely was able to ride through the S-400, S-300, and S-400 air defenses of Iran, the big questions about the quality of Russian weapons will only grow. So that, and then the other element is the oil, and everybody said, you just follow the G7's sanctions, the rules, which is basically you're free to do whatever you want from $60 if the oil is below $60 a barrel. Then again, no issues. There's secondary sanctions a bit more complicated, partly because sometimes I think Indian firms don't fully understand how they work. But again, they've been largely slaps on the wrist. India has not complained if one of their companies decides to break secondary sanctions. India's view, and most of these are really tiny companies, really fly-by-night stuff. India doesn't have an issue. But Russia, yes, Putin, for some good reason or bad reason, Trump really admires Vladimir Putin. And he likes Russia. But his overall foreign policy team are very clear. China is our enemy number one, number two, number three. Russia is not a threat to the United States. And if the Ukraine has to be defended, it should be done by Europe, with America at best at a supportive role. And the fact that America is having to lead this is a source of great irritation. We are diverting attention and resources from the threat to China, and we are fighting or supporting a war in which Europeans should have been taking the lead on. So yes, we will see. I mean, if there is any country that should be nervous about Trump's coming to power, it's Ukraine. I mean, they are the one country that has really not succeeded in building a bridge or getting a single good word from him. So that is a clear sign that that's going to be an issue. And you can see Russia, well, ironically, Putin then endorsed Kamala Harris for the presidency. Everybody assumes that he was being ironic or deliberately not trying to disturb Trump's likelihoods of election. But yes, we will not see, I don't think we will have a problem. We don't see much of a problem. We have virtually no problem at all on our relationship with Russia from Trump. If anything, I think the Trump guys would probably come to India and said, we are now going to move towards a post-conflict situation in Ukraine.
Ukraine, of course, is not the only active war where the United States is a primary, well, if not primary, one of the key factors. Let's turn to the Middle East for a minute. Vice President Harris made a statement after Israel's killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, framing his death as a watershed moment that would open the path to a ceasefire. Of course, a ceasefire has not happened yet. President Trump has expressed that he would support Israel's bid to destroy Hamas, which many are predicting would extend the conflict in the wider region. How do you see this playing out, and how do you think that will impact India?
You know, all the evidence indicates, whether it's Biden and definitely Harris on the campaign trail, that American support for Israel remains basically untouched. That whatever the protests may do, they may get a lot of noise, and whatever the Arab American population in Michigan may complain about, the only element of the Democratic, only a part of the entire political spectrum that is really has become violently anti-Israeli is the progressive Democrats on the far left. And they don't really have any place to go. They're not going to vote for Trump. So the Democratic Party, definitely the national security structure, the overall Washington as a whole, has basically said, we think Netanyahu is off the rails a bit here, but America's commitment to a country that is a military ally, and this is one is there. It's not going to change. And Harris has not budged. She has been very, very clear that she supports Biden's policy. I expect that would be watered down a bit. But the real issue is, the only point of real leverage America has is to basically cut weapon supplies. And I just don't see anybody in the American system doing that. The outcry within the system that you can't do this to Israel is too strong. And keep in mind that there is sympathy for the Palestinians. There is no sympathy for Iran within the United States. Iran is seen as an enemy nation. And Trump, one of the interesting things about Trump, when he talks, especially before he became president, when he talks about foreign policy, he always cites that one of the most, in his view, the most traumatic incidents in foreign policy that he remembers was the Iran hostage crisis. And it was one of the reasons that led to him to assassinate Soleimani, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leader, despite actually the recommendations of his own staff, because he said, we can never show weakness to Iran. We know what they're like. So I don't see that. So when it comes to Iran, there is no votary there's nobody calling for moderation with Israel. On the Palestinian cause, there is, but not with Iran.
Let's try to paint a worst case scenario and a best case scenario in a Trump presidency in the larger Middle East, and how that impacts India, according to you.
Not very much either way, frankly. The only real issue and the rest of the world really now looks at the Middle East as a sort of little box of completely crazy people. And as long as it doesn't spread, they don't really care. So for India, the game is, and continues to be, whatever little we can do is about not having the war spread. It's not about trying to stop the war. That's not how the Middle East works. Nobody is prepared to invest. Even China, having made one feeble attempt, just basically given up.
All right, so let's conclude from that the secondary effects that we just painted are all far-fetched, because we don't see either Israel or Iran going beyond certain sets of actions.
They get no benefit from expanding the war, or the damage to them would be probably greater than it would be to the rest of the planet.
I'm hesitant to say, but that sounds comforting. So final question, and this one about the election itself. Let's come back to continental United States. Multiple reports of it being a tight race, a historically tight race, people say, to the point that many people are reporting that there is an effort to change the electoral system of Nebraska to go from proportional to winner takes all, so that the second congressional district's one electoral vote is also not in play. If it's that tight, that means there's going to be recounts. There's possibility of many legal challenges. Where do you think in the US things will get the messiest? And how long do you think the process will be post November 5th?
So as you said, it depends on how tight it is. That's the core of it. The reason why everybody's taking, or should I say, nobody's taking any chances on this, preparing their lawyers to fight state by state, to get briefs in the Supreme Court, to try to ensure that their people are there counting or in the counting rooms when it happens. is because nobody trusts the polls anymore. Polling in America is as now bad as polling in India, arguably worse. If both in the last two presidential elections, the polls massively underestimated Trump support. Biden still won in the last election, but he was expected to win by 8 to 9 percentage points of popular vote. He won by only 4 or 5. In a state like Wisconsin, Trump polled 9 percentage points higher than what the pollsters had expected, which makes the poll almost useless. You might as well just flip a coin. And this happened in the first Trump victory. And the pollsters said, oh, we've adjusted for the hidden Trump support. And then it repeated itself again in the second election. Now nobody trusts the pollsters. And it's not even a question. First, they thought it was people who supported Trump were lying when they would speak to pollsters. Now they think it's a combination of that, plus a lot of Trump people don't talk to surveyors at all, or pollsters were just missing groups of people here and there who supported Trump. This election, everybody's waiting to see if the pollsters get it right. But if they once again misjudge Trump support, then this election is Trump's, because in the 7 swing states that are general consensus of swing states, Harris does not lead in any of them by more than 1 percentage point, and has in fact been slipping in some of them, notably Wisconsin and Michigan. And in the bigger states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, it's either a tie or a 1% lead, which is within the statistical margin of error anyway. So if Trump support continues to be at least even 2 percentage points of hidden Trump support, then Trump should win these states easily. And I think in Arizona, Nevada, he's already in the lead, and in North Carolina, Georgia as well. So this should be a Trump victory, in which case I don't actually expect too much of a battle to break out if he wins so many states. Now, let's suppose Harris squeaks by. It was said that Biden won the last election because of 45,000 votes. So that was how narrow the point of victory is. Some of the studies I've seen for this election is that about 80,000 voters will decide this election, which means you're going to get at least 2 to 3, at least 2 swing states are going to just be squeak by victories, whereupon you start to go into litigation. You could see some violence, but the litigation will be the bigger problem. And if Harris wins, is declared the winner on the basis of just, let's say, 10,000 votes in Wisconsin or something like that, or Pennsylvania, there will be litigation. There may even be some violence. So yes, you will see battles at the state level or at the local level, at the ballot basis, and then you will see battles at the legal level, and then you will see battles potentially all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the Constitution still requires a president to be sworn in by January. It doesn't actually give you a means to get around that. So the Supreme Court would, if it gets all the way up to there, would have to make a call probably before Christmas. So by potentially all the way up to mid-December, we could see battles all the way.
Well, let's prepare ourselves to follow that, I guess. Thank you so much, Pramit. This was very insightful. And I think we're going to check back in with you after the elections to see how the world is faring. But thank you for joining us. See you soon.